How much do you think America's most famous jeweler took in its first 3 days? $4.98. That was September 1837 on Broadway. The banks suspended, half of New York ruined, the worst month in a generation to open a shop. So how does that shop end up buying a third of the French crown jewels? But the answer is not jewelry. For its first 11 years, this company did not sell a single diamond. Instead, it is a revolution the founder had nothing to do with, a war that no luxury house would touch, and 2 rules that everyone in 1837 thought were commercial suicide. This is new American fortunes, where almost none of them ended the way they began. Charles Louis Tiffany was 25 years old, and he had never run a shop of his own. What he had was $1,000 borrowed from his father, who ran a cotton mill in Connecticut, and a school friend named John Young who went in with him. They took a room at 259 Broadway in Lower Manhattan and opened the doors. What they sold was stationery and fancy goods, writing paper, desk sets, walking sticks, umbrellas, and small decorative objects that a household might buy but did not need. Not a single diamond, not one. They had also managed to pick the worst possible month of the worst possible year. The Panic of 1837 had already arrived, and the banks of New York had suspended payment in coin, which is the 19th century way of saying that if you took your money to the bank would not give it to you. Businesses that had stood for decades were closing inside a month, yet these 2 opened anyway. So what do you sell in a city where nobody has any money out of a shop full of things that nobody needs? For 3 days, the answer was $4.98 worth. That is not a slow start. That is a shop which is failing. But Tiffany did 2 things in that room that were far stranger than anything in his inventory. The first was that he marked a price on every item and then refused to move it. In 1837, that was close to an insult. Retail was a negotiation. A shopkeeper read your coat, read your accent, and named a number. Haggling was not a tactic, it was the entire transaction. Tiffany put a number on the object and let it sit there, the same for every person who walked through the door. The second rule was that he sold for cash only. No credit, no accounts, and no ledger of gentlemen who would settle up in the spring. Every other shop in New York extended credit, and most of them thought he was mad not to. But in the middle of a panic caused by credit collapsing, a shop that refused to extend any looked less like arrogance and more like the only sane business in the city. It worked slowly, and then it worked. Yet the thing that actually made Tiffany rich happened 11 years later, 3,000 miles away, and he had almost nothing to do with it. In February of 1848, revolution came to Paris. Louis-Philippe abdicated and fled. The monarchy was finished inside 2 days, and the aristocracy of France went out of the city behind him. And people who leave in a hurry sell whatever they cannot carry. John Young was in Paris. What he bought there from frightened people at frightened prices was diamonds in quantity. Then he carried them back across the Atlantic to a shop that had never sold a diamond in its life. That is the turn of this entire story, and notice that it is not a strategy and not a decision made in a boardroom. It is a revolution somebody else had, and a partner who happened to be standing in the right city with cash in his pocket. And they had cash in their pocket precisely because they had spent 11 years refusing to sell on credit. The 2 rules that had looked like commercial suicide in a failing stationery shop had just bought them the inventory of a monarchy. Note the name, though, because it matters later. In 1848, the firm was still trading as Tiffany, Young, and Ellis. It did not become Tiffany & Company until 1853, when Charles bought his partners out. But the diamonds were already in the cases by then, and the stationery shop was over. 13 years after that, The country went to war with itself. And Tiffany did something that no luxury house on earth would do today. He cleared the showroom. The fine goods came off the shelves, the cases were emptied, and Charles Tiffany turned his showrooms for fine jewelry into a depot for military supplies. Swords, medals, surgical instruments. Cavalry sabres at $4.50 apiece, sold to militia regiments and to army officers buying for themselves. $4.50. Almost exactly what the entire shop had taken in its first 3 days of trading 24 years earlier. Now it was the price of a single blade. And at the other end of the same counter, presentation swords made for named officers, engraved and mounted at $500, $1,000, and at the very top of the range, $10,000. The same firm, the same room, in the same week. There is one question about those swords that the record does not settle cleanly, and it is worth being honest about it. Some accounts say that Tiffany manufactured them outright. But others say the blades came from Peter Lunischloss, a bladesmith in Solingen, in Prussia, and from Collins and Company of Hartford, Connecticut, and that what Tiffany actually did was finish them, mount them, and mark them. The surviving objects seem to settle it. Tiffany sabres are described by the people who physically handle them as having an American hilt and a German blade, which means Tiffany was never a forge. Instead, it was a firm that could find the best version of a thing anywhere in the world, finish it to a standard, and put its own name on the result. Hold on to that, because it turns out to be the entire company. One of those swords survives with a name attached to it, a 32-inch blade, a knight's head at the pommel, and a lion at the guard, carried by General Daniel Sickles of the Excelsior Brigade, who fought at Gettysburg. And in the newspapers, Tiffany advertised that it would fill orders by mail and ship to the loyal states. A shop that had sold writing paper through one national catastrophe was selling sabres through the next one. And if you've got this far, this is the kind of story the channel exists to tell. Subscribing genuinely helps it keep going. Then the war ended, and this is where the story stops being about a shop at all, because the skill that Tiffany had spent 25 years building was never jewelry making. He was not a jeweler, and he never had been. What he had built was sourcing and finishing and standards, and a name that meant the thing inside the box was exactly what the box said it was. And that, it turned out, traveled a great deal further than diamonds. In 1878, the French government decorated Charles Tiffany with the ribbon of the Legion of Honor, which is not a thing France hands out to shopkeepers. In 1886, the firm finally did the thing that you would actually recognize. It took the diamond off the band and lifted it up on 6 prongs, clear of the metal, where the light could get underneath it. The Tiffany setting. Nearly 140 years later, that is still essentially what an engagement ring looks like. And then, in 1887, France sold its crown jewels. The Republic had very little use for the personal jewelry of the monarchy it had replaced, and a great deal of use for the money, so it put the collection up at auction at the Louvre. Now, who do you think France asked to handle the American end of that sale? Not a Paris house, and not a European auctioneer. On Sunday, the 24th of April, 1887, 3 weeks before the auction opened, the New York Tribune printed the answer. It was Charles Louis Tiffany, the stationer. The Tribune reported that he thought a great deal of the honor of being appointed American agent in the sale of the crown jewels of France, and noted dryly that France had already decorated him once 9 years before. So he was never a bidder who simply turned up with money. He was the house that the French state chose to route its own sale through, and then he bought roughly a third of them. 50 years after a room on Broadway took $4.98 in 3 days, the French Republic handed its crown jewels to the man who had been standing behind that counter. Charles Louis Tiffany died in 1902. His son took over the design of the company, Louis Comfort Tiffany, who became more famous than his father, and not for diamonds at all, but for glass. And the company itself was bought by the French luxury group LVMH in 2021, which means the crown jewels of France and the shop that bought them have finally ended up under the same ownership. But go back to the room. September 1837. 2 men in their 20s, 1,000 borrowed dollars, and a country where the banks had stopped paying in coin, and the safest possible thing to do with a shop was not to open it. 3 days of trading, $4.98. Nothing about that week says crown jewels. It does not even say jewelry. All it says is that on the 4th day, despite everything, they opened again. So tell me the smallest, least promising beginning you have ever watched turn into something. A business, a band, a shop on your street that had no right to make it. What was it, and what did it become?